The total number of minds in the universe is one. In fact, consciousness is a singularity phasing within all beings. Dr. Erwin Schrödinger. Albert Einstein once said that everything is energy and that's all there is to it. And expanding on that, he said that concerning matter, we have been all wrong. What we have called matter is really energy, whose vibration has been so lowered as to be perceivable to the senses. There is no matter. End quote. This is a vertical diagram that represents the full range of frequencies in nature and its various forms of energy. All manifested things in the universe are shown in this relatively simple spectrum of energy. On the left side of the chart, there's a red beam winding from top to bottom, like a sine wave, and it represents frequencies. This part of the chart is the electromagnetic spectrum. So I'll start with the bandwidth or range of frequency that we're all familiar with, the physical range. This is the physical world that us humans and animals inhabit, with its 3 dimensions. We also call this the material world because we perceive it as being made up of matter, particles, atoms. So the reason why the physical world is on this electromagnetic scale is because physical matter is not separate from subtle energy. It's not excluded in science as this separate, gross, concrete element. In fact, as I just quoted from Albert Einstein, matter is really just energy in a different form. A very dense, slow vibrating, concrete form. Now, for most of us, due to the quality of consciousness that we have, we can only perceive things at the very level within which we abide, the physical level. And this is because our consciousness is conditioned. It's limited. So if there's an object sitting right in front of us, we can see it, we can hear it, we can touch it, and maybe it has a taste or a smell. But that's it. And our sensory experience tends to end there. But what we don't usually perceive is whether or not something is giving off some kind of radiation, like ultraviolet or infrared or nuclear. We also can't tell where something came from. We don't have physical clues, nor can we say what will happen to it in the future. If we take human vision, for example, we can perceive 3 dimensions and 7 colors. But does that mean that we are seeing the entirety of light and color? Well, we can't see ultraviolet, and we can't see infrared. And what about human hearing range? We can apparently hear sounds that are between 20 and 20,000 hertz. Personally, I can only hear up to 16,000 hertz. But a dog can hear a lot more. A dog's hearing can reach up to 65,000 hertz. So in reality, the range of light and perception in the universe is incredibly vast, and we are only experiencing a small ounce of it. When we go beyond the 5 senses, there are in fact many more subtle forms of energy at both higher and lower frequencies that are not perceivable with our physical senses. So on the chart just above or next to the physical world, often labeled the visible range, we have the invisible, high-frequency waveforms: ultraviolet, X-ray, and gamma ray. And if we look at the waveforms that vibrate just below the visible spectrum, there exist infrared waves, microwaves, and radio waves. And after that range, energy is considerably dense and physical and able to create sound. So in regular physics, the electromagnetic spectrum always stops at the radio wave range and peaks at gamma rays. And that's because if you go any higher or any lower than this spectrum, you enter the field of subatomic science. So think of the word atomic, relating to physical matter made of atoms. Now put sub in front of that. Now you're looking at things that are beyond the physical atomic level. Now you're dealing with a totally different level of physics. And you've probably heard the term. It's called quantum physics. And this is where things become very strange. Now in reality, all these different and diverse forms of energy are all interactive and contain consciousness. In Eastern religions, this life force that animates all things is called prana in Buddhism and Hinduism, qi in Chinese Taoism, and ki in Japanese Zen Buddhism. In the West, when philosophers and scientists were first discovering this universal energy, they called it ether. The 4th century BC philosopher Aristotle proposed the ether to be the 5th element postulated by his teacher Plato. In occultism, it's taught that within man, the microcosm, exists the entire universe, the macrocosm. And this is the astonishing fact that utterly bewildered scientists at the beginning of modern science, when the very first quantum physics experiments were being run. So what they discovered was that all the particles they were experimenting with, all the atoms and the electrons that make up those atoms, had observer-dependent behavior. So in the case of these experiments, the observers were the scientists. And what was happening with the electrons, for example, was that they were switching between two modes of behavior, depending on whether or not the scientists were looking at them through the microscope. It was almost as if, since the scientists could clearly see what the particle would do next under the microscope, the particle was, in a sense, forced to act in the usual way that we expected to. Otherwise, we wouldn't easily be able to make sense of what we're seeing. If, for example, the particle were to duplicate itself into clones from different dimensions. Can you imagine seeing that under a microscope? It's like trying to imagine seeing copies of people shift in and out of parallel universes with the naked eye. And that happens all the time. We just can't see it, usually, because we are mostly three-dimensional people with a limited consciousness. And you may have already heard about some of these experiments I was referring to. The earliest and most famous one was called the double slit experiment, in which an electron beam gun would shoot electrons, pieces of matter, toward a metallic plate with two open slots cut out. And at the end of the slotted plate was a receiving wall upon which the electrons could strike and leave a mark or pattern. Now, to imagine this in the real world, this is comparable to taking a small rock and throwing it through a chain link fence and allowing it to strike a wall on the other side. And logically, the rock would simply pass through one of the fence holes and hit the wall directly, leaving a mark. So when scientists performed this under the microscope, the electrons often just did that. They would pass right through one of the open slots in the plate and leave a little mark on the receiving wall. So here's where it gets weird. There was a point where they would run the experiment and shoot the electrons without looking at the particles, without using the microscope for observation. This was done one particle at a time, by the way. And what they found was that many times, these single particles were creating wave patterns on the other side of the slotted plate by duplicating themselves instantaneously. Is that not strange and unexpected? Almost illogical? We're just dealing with pieces of matter here, after all. And where were these extra duplicates of electrons coming from? So this phenomenon is like what you get when you have water flowing through an obstruction like the slotted metal plate. If you move water through something like the double slot, the obstruction would create some kind of wave pattern, right? Since the water is acting as one large, dense body that's being disturbed by an obstruction. And if you looked at the water from slightly above, you would see these waves expanding and moving away from the obstruction. Can you create a wave pattern with one strike of a paintbrush? Or one shot of a paintball gun? You can't. You would need an entire body of paint, or a field of paint to do that. Because in that way, you could simply disturb the field with a coffee stick, for example, and that would create waves. And that's another key element that the scientists discovered, that the reason why electrons were creating wave patterns was because there must have been some kind of invisible field or matrix within which everything travels and interacts. And the most peculiar thing is why the particles behaved differently depending on whether or not they were looking at them. And this is where the concept of quantum field consciousness comes into play. This is where the Buddhist law of interdependence becomes more evident. The law of interdependence states that there is a profound state of connectedness among all things in the universe, that one thing could not exist without the other. So since the early 1900s, quantum physics has only expanded, and numerous other quantum experiments have been made. Some of them suggest the existence of the multiverse, a world in which we live in interwoven layers of dimensions, where we continuously shift back and forth between parallel universes. Another simple experiment that's been done many times includes the use of a random number generator in combination with a person's mental focus. So they would simply have someone sit next to this number generator without any cables or connections and just focus on a specific number in mind. And astonishingly, much of the time, the number generator would experience a mean shift. So the probability would shift, and the computer would start repeating the same number that the person had in mind. And similar experiments have been performed over long distances between subjects. And scientists have found that physical distance doesn't make any difference to the result. So again, this is related to the concept of field consciousness. Your mind can affect whatever you focus on. And since the mind runs at a very subtle level, physical distance usually doesn't affect the connection between mind and subject, or mind and mind. And sadly, the most powerful example of collective consciousness affecting random number generators was during the world's most catastrophic events. Since the late 90s, the Global Consciousness Project had fixed dozens of random number generators around the world to see if they could find any coherency between the computers if an emotional outpouring were to happen during a worldwide crisis. And what they found was exactly that. Patterns of the computers became more synchronized and coherent with every major event. The first report happened in 1997 when Princess Diana died. And it happened again when the Concorde jet first crashed. It happened during the Madrid train bombing. And it also happened on the Pope's funeral. And on September 11th, 2001, the network of random number generators became more coherent and less random again, a couple hours before the first plane strike. And it was calculated that the phenomenon of coherency among the computers in all these events had a 1 in 100 billion chance of being just a coincidence. This is why, in spite of all the time and research that science has put into studying the human brain and nervous system and so forth, we're finding more and more evidence that the very force of consciousness itself cannot be found in the physical brain or heart. So although consciousness works through physical mediums, such as the brain and the heart, those organs themselves are not the source of consciousness. As is the microcosm, so is the macrocosm. As is the atom, so is the universe. As is the human mind, so is the cosmic mind. Deepak Chopra. The laws of each plane of existence increase more and more in octaves as we descend through manifestation, down the ray of creation. The source of the universe contains only one law, and the base of the universe has 864 laws. These are esoteric laws. Now, what happens to energy below the radio wave and physical range is that it becomes so dense and slow that it exists non-physically again. This is the subconscious range or plane of existence. And it just so happens that for most of us, about 97% of our consciousness resides at this level, is trapped at this level. That's why when speaking about the brain or the mind, scientists often refer to the mind as the subconscious mind. And if you read books that explain how to practice lucid dreaming, you'll notice that there's a lot of mentioning about the subconscious mind and how it produces dreams. But the authors don't usually call what we have simply the conscious mind. So the subconscious range is a lower bandwidth of energy. And since we're looking at non-physical reality again, it's also part of the fifth dimension, but it's inverted in relation to the superior fifth dimension. In the East, The makeup of energies and frequencies in the subconscious realm is called skandhas in Sanskrit. Skandhas means heaps, or collections, or aggregates. These skandhas form in a similar way that rocks and minerals form, by crystallizing very slowly over time. So for people who are not familiar with spirituality, when we hear someone say that so-and-so has a big ego, we usually just think that the person means that they have a lot of pride. And that's what we think the ego is, a proud sense of self. And it's true, that's a huge part of it. But it's just one piece. So what a lot of us don't know is that the ego is really the Western term for the word skandhas. And since skandhas means aggregates, the ego is, in its entirety, is a collection of dense, slow vibrating, subconscious and infraconscious forms. Because if you analyze them, you can see that they're not natural. They don't actually contain consciousness. So they don't even operate within conscious nature. They belong to a lower level of evolution called mechanical nature, which is very habitual and automatic and instinctual. And so what creatures can you think of have repetitive instinctual behaviors and habits? We say that animals have instinct. So they have this ability to survive and function, but most of them don't really think for themselves or make deliberate, conscious decisions. And everything they do seems to be ruled by this automatic, instinctual force. We also say that humans are creatures of habit, and there are countless things that we do automatically without having to think about it, that we oftentimes barely realize we're doing. So both animals and humans have a mind that functions almost entirely within the subconscious dimension, within mechanical nature. But I said that the subconsciousness, the ego, in itself is not conscious. So then the question is, how can we think and feel and perceive if our minds vibrate at that lower, unconscious level? Well, the nature of consciousness is that it flows through all things and animates everything. So when something comes into the conscious field, it interfaces with it. And that's what happens with our subconsciousness or ego. It operates mechanically under the scenes and follows its own agenda until something more active and conscious can animate it. As a result, we typically function and perceive things with the ego in a somewhat conscious way, because we have some connection with the higher active consciousness. That's the field consciousness illuminating through the ego. So consciousness exists in levels, as you can see here. And as I mentioned earlier, since our minds are about 97% ego, we only have a very small 3% worth of pure state consciousness that is free of ego. And what this ultimately means for us is that our mind is very limited. It's heavily conditioned. So to try to get a better understanding of this dynamic between consciousness and ego, we can consider that consciousness is a type of light source. If you know anything about the function of vision, you know that in order to see shapes and colors, you need light to animate everything. It's the same thing with photography. The only way a camera can take a picture is if it absorbs light and then captures the impression. What if you place a strong blue filter or a strong green filter over the lens of a camera and then take the shot? Would that camera provide an accurate picture of what you were looking at with your bare eyes? No. Everything would look distorted, right? The whole image would have stronger hues of blue or green. And furthermore, the light source is coming from all the surrounding ambient light, the sun, the windows, the lights inside, the room you're in. So the filter itself doesn't produce any light. It's not the light source. It just modifies the light to a more narrow and specific bandwidth of frequencies. The blue filter, for example, leaves out all the other color frequencies and just reveals blue. And that's exactly what the ego does. The ego is not part of field consciousness. It just modifies and specifies certain frequencies within high consciousness. In Christianity, The ego is represented by the 7 deadly sins. Most of us have heard of them. In Buddhism, the 5 skulls on Yama's headdress symbolize the same thing. If you've ever seen that Buddhist painting of the Wheel of Samsara, or the Wheel of Life, with all the different little beings inhabiting it in different parts of the wheel, Yama is the one, that great beast, clenching the wheel with his jaws and hands. So symbolically, tradition has listed for us 5 to 7 primary egos: anger, pride, jealousy, greed or gluttony, avarice. But in the real world, since the ego means aggregates or groupings, it truly is a countless collection of formations in the mind. Just like a composite rock that's made up of all sorts of minerals and crystals and metals. This is why we always disagree with each other. This is why people argue so much all the time. This is why we have personal opinion. There are thousands of egos, and every ego has a different desire, a different attachment, a different agenda. We can be extremely angry and feel the urge to take revenge, even though at the end of the day, we just want to forgive the person so that we can move on. We can be very angry at someone, but the stress also causes us to break down and cry and feel sorrow. We always have mixed and opposing emotions. So really, a mind that has ego is a contradictory state of consciousness. That's also why the level of mind that we operate at is also known as subjective reality. We don't see the truth. Now, what kind of traits are we dealing with here that are apparently mechanical and instinctual and subjective? Well, we do have a number of beneficial egos that help us in various ways, but for the most part, our egos have very negative and perverted qualities, and they're always attached to the things they like. And the same goes for the good egos. So personality traits and preferences of the ego include, but are not limited to, lust, anger, pride, laziness, gluttony, greed, materialism, anxiety, which leads to neurotic behaviors and OCD, and fear. And to clarify on the different states of consciousness and various planes of existence, I should mention that these two subjects are essentially the same thing. So every plane of existence has its psychological correspondence. For example, a being who primarily lives in the physical world stays there because their mind vibrates at that level, somewhere between physicality and subconsciousness. And if their mind were to transcend physicality and begin vibrating at a higher and more subtle level, then their consciousness would continue to live there even after their physical body dies. The subconscious and infraconscious dimensions are often referred to as the inferior worlds. The Jewish mystical tradition of Kabbalah calls these realms the klipot, which means empty shells. And in major religions, these dimensions are classically known as hell. Now let's move on to the top left of the chart. We have forms of energy that are so subtle and vibrate so fast that they exist non-physically again, in the 4th and 5th dimensions and beyond. The early stages of these dimensions begin and register energetically as our positive emotions and thoughts, which are very subtle. Now we're looking at the superior worlds, which belong to conscious nature. So far, we've divided the mind into 2 parts, 2 broad levels. One of them is subconscious, and the other one, conscious, or supraconscious, is sometimes referred to. In Eastern mysticism, these are also known as manas in Sanskrit, which means mind or thinker. So with that being said, there exist the inferior manas and the superior manas. The inferior manas is the intellectual aspect of the subconsciousness. The superior manas belongs to the conscious realm as high intelligence. This is where objective reality begins, since consciousness is now being shared in an open matrix where everything can be perceived and known without confusion or variance in perspective. This clarity and objectivity comes from the fact that this level of mind is not modified or limited by the ego. The psychological traits of this level are more consistent and work in harmony with one another. Compassion, remorse, assertiveness, courage, and diligence or activity are all related emotions because they are united with love as the governing power. This means that conscious qualities don't have individual interest in themselves or any attachment. So assertiveness, for example, doesn't keep taking for itself and leaving remorse and compassion neglected. No. Conscious traits are supportive of one another. And this differs from defects because in the case of the ego, it's so individualized that anger can sometimes overpower guilt. You know, when you felt a little bit guilty for something, and then maybe you started to think that the other person was wrong actually, and then you got angry, and the anger took over. These kinds of contradictions happen all the time. We get angry, then we say sorry, and then we get angry again. If you didn't have a pure conscience, you wouldn't be able to love. If you didn't have love, you wouldn't have the compassion to help other people or spend time with your children. If you didn't have love, you wouldn't have the courage to help someone in a dire situation. So you see how conscious love is a governing force? And so our subtle, high-frequency emotions are actually the qualities that inspired our earliest concepts of virtue. Now, being the thinker, there's also another very elusive and powerful aspect about the superior manas, and that is its intelligence. The superior manas, or consciousness, vibrates above the five senses, which are physical. So what's beyond the five senses? Well, it's not the intellect, because most of our thoughts are still part of the ego, the inferior manas. So what is beyond the five senses is the sixth sense. So actually, the superior manas is intuition. Now, generally speaking, the astral plane, the world of dreams, is considered the fifth dimension. But the superior manas is more specifically located in the sixth dimension, the world of causes. And whenever we perceive at higher levels of consciousness, we're using our intuition to understand and know things. We're not using our intellect and thinking to get the answers. So intuition is the perception of field or unity consciousness, and the way it reveals itself to us can vary. If we're in a lightly drowsy state, we might just hear a very clear voice in the head of someone that we know, but the voice seems to be answering to a problem that we've had in mind. Or we might notice that a thought very unexpectedly intervenes between our usual thoughts and imagination. And then we think, oh, who said that? Did I say that? Was I thinking that? Other times you fall a bit drowsy and you start to see dream imagery fade in for a moment and fade out. But if you pay attention, you'll start to recognize that it's symbolic and it's relevant and it's answering your questions or suggesting you to do things. The nature of pure state consciousness is that it has a spontaneous, active, continual awareness from moment to moment and doesn't require any effort to sustain concentration. So it's only when the subconsciousness, or ego, comes into contact with consciousness that our vital energy starts to get withdrawn from nature's supply, the ether, and used up by the ego. As soon as consciousness becomes modified by the ego, it becomes limited to the extent of the ego. And this is why we get distracted all the time, and why we easily tire after performing a certain task or feeding a certain emotion over a period of time. It's not always the physical things that we do. It's how and where we place attention. And since our mind is 97% conditioned by the ego, we actually use up a lot more energy than we need to, just because we're constantly focusing on different desires. And so the ego traps consciousness down into various levels, causing us to drift into a deep state of psychological sleep. This is the hypnotic state that we're usually in, where we lose self-awareness and get distracted easily. And we don't even think that we're hypnotized, because we're so used to it, this state of consciousness. And then when we get really hypnotized by a hypnotist, then we're totally asleep. Just like the way we experience dreams on a regular basis. just doing things mechanically without even realizing what's going on. So we lose self-awareness when we're caught up in chit-chat with someone, and especially when we watch TV. We just get completely hypnotized and sucked into the TV show like we don't even exist. We forget ourselves. And at the same time, we're feeding these lower aggregates with our own vital energy, the prana or ether that I mentioned earlier, and this makes us more tired than we have to be. So truthfully, humans are a very inefficient species. We have too many desires, too many aversions, and far too much stress. If you've ever had a day where you were angry all day long or really stressed out and anxious by something, and then you came back home from school or work, and you sat down on the couch and you just fell asleep immediately. And you woke up and you amazed yourself by how quick that happened. Then you know what it's like. Or maybe you broke down in tears just from all the stress and didn't even expect it. This is what happens when you strain your focus on something for too long. So consciousness can either be in a passive state, like when you're hypnotized by TV, or it can be in an active state, when you're trying to pay attention to something. But we're usually in a passive, somnambulistic state. And that's why for us, we have to put a lot of effort into staying focused on something. So you can think of the mind that we have as a light bulb, but it's a very dim and kind of omnidirectional one. So it shines in one direction for a bit, and then it shines in another, but it doesn't have any anchoring focus. It doesn't always focus on the present moment. It just gets drawn from one desire to another. Now, if you compare this kind of mind to the superior manas, the unmodified consciousness, this light is like a radiant sun or a high-power spotlight. It has undivided attention on the present moment, and it can maintain that for any amount of time, as well as this radiant self-awareness. Now, just to clarify terms, concentration is simply the ability to focus on something. But the meaning of awareness is more broad. Awareness can be spatial or related to understanding, the bigger picture in mind. So somebody with a high level of awareness can be really focused on what they're doing right now, but equally aware of potential consequences, and equally aware of himself or herself. So when your awareness is high, you can consider things like, who is doing this? Why am I doing this? What are the consequences? How is this going to affect other people? Is this really important right now? So somebody who is awake, that term we're starting to hear more and more these days, Jim Carrey is awake. Eckhart Tolle on awakening. That kind of person can see the bigger picture in life. So they don't waste time on insignificant, foolish things. Whether or not we have makeup on, how we styled our hair, who said what about us. They never lose focus or awareness. This includes self-awareness. They are present from moment to moment, all day and all night, never fantasizing. And as a result, this also means that the person is still awake or conscious when they sleep. And at that point, they're able to continue on with their business in the astral plane, in the world of dreams. And this usually includes meditation, different kinds of healing, or teaching Dharma. This is what it's like to have the mind of a Buddha. Incredible willpower, infinite concentration, and vast awareness. It's taught in mysticism that the liberation of a soul from suffering begins at the 6th dimension, in the world of causes. So the beings that have their superior manas, their body of will or intuition, more developed, live more profoundly in the causal world. But this is only as a result of reducing the ego. And since these beings don't carry cravings or fears, they can withstand anything. So generally, we say that these beings abide in nirvana, or heaven. These are angels, Buddhas, and masters. We sometimes translate nirvana as bliss. It's a feeling of pure joy, and happiness, and serenity, without overexcitement or attachment. And finally, at the very top of this ray of creation rests the primordial void of the universe. In its absolute state, it does not exist. Therefore, it has no laws. It has no sex or gender, and it has no energy signature. It is both empty, and yet all forms originate from this void of pure potentiality. And in its first breath, when it takes a first step into creation, as described in Hinduism, it becomes the principal origin of reality. This is also where it begins to develop a sense of self. This is the creator, the emptiness, the absolute, God. Some people call it source. Other names you may have heard: Brahma, Allah, Elohim, Ra from ancient Egypt, and in Kabbalah, Ein Sof, or Ein Sof Or, the latter being the light aspect that emerges from the first step of creation. Now, since I tend to refer to Buddhism and Kabbalah frequently, I will translate the last terms. Ein Sof means infinite. So we say the unbounded, the unending, or endless one. And since Or means light, Ein Sof Or tends to be translated as infinite light, or limitless light. And some Gnostics say empty, limitless light. The Ein Sof Or state of mind is sometimes described as a shining void when experienced in meditation. The tree of evolution I have sketched, each branch and twig and leaf in its own place. In the embryo, tracked the history of forms and the genealogy framed of all that lives. I have detected plasm and cell and gene, the protozoa traced, man's ancestors, the humble originals from whom he rose. I know how he was born and how he dies. Only what end he serves, I know not yet. Or if there is aim at all, or any end or push of rich, creative, purposeful joy in the white works of the terrestrial power. When he says this, he means the White Lodge, or the benevolent use of creativity, or white magic. No racial connotations here. I have caught her intricate processes. None is left. Her huge machinery is in my hands. I have seized the cosmic energies for my use. I have bored on her infinitesimal elements, and her invisible atoms I have unmasked. All matter is a book I have bruised. Only some pages now are left to read. If God is at work, his secrets I have found, but still, the cause of things is left in doubt. Their truth flees from pursuit into a void. When all has been explained, nothing is known. What I have learned, chance seems to contradict. What I have built is seized and torn by fate. I can foresee the acts of matter's force, but not the march of the destiny of man. He is driven upon parts he did not choose. He falls, trampled underneath the rolling wheels. Perhaps the world is an error of our sight, a trick repeated in each flash of sense. An unreal mind hallucinates the soul with the stretched vision of false reality, or a dance of Maya veiling the void of the unmanifested one. We too are machines amidst the machine. A piston brain pumps out the shades of thought. A beating heart cuts out emotions, modes. An insentient energy fabricates a soul. Sri Aurobindo.